千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
So, let's take a look at what we have done so far with chapter 30 and figure out where we want to go from here. Previously, we analyzed the sections in chapter 30. This is what we ended up with. 4 sections. You may recall that the first section, the beginning section, was about the advisor to the king. And another level of that, hopefully you recall as well, is that in this life, as you are the ruler of your own life, you are also the advisor to yourself. Thus, it is up to you whether or not you wish to use the Tao to advise yourself. The second section is about the inadvisability of counseling yourself to use the army or military force, or in this case, in the context of your life, to pick a fight with other people. Whether it's to argue with them, or maybe even a physical altercation, fighting is not advisable in the Tao. So the second section uses a couple of metaphors to talk about why. And I do want to make sure that everyone understands exactly what those metaphors are and what they stand for. You can express those metaphors in your own words. That's going to be one of the important goals of our talk on 30. In the third section, you notice that this is where we have a lot of the repeating characters. So the third section talks about what happens when someone who understands the Tao, someone who cultivates the Tao, is forced in a situation to fight. So this entire section can be summarized into 6 rules that the Tao cultivator must follow in order to engage in some sort of conflict. So it is not completely impossible for the Tao cultivator to find themselves in a situation where they have to fight. Not impossible at all, because none of us is perfect. If we mismanage a situation, we can find ourselves backed into a corner having to fight. So when that is the case, there's a whole bunch of different rules that Lao Tzu has expressed to say that, okay, fight if you must, but there are certain things you cannot do. You cannot fight and win and then gloat about it, for instance. So we'll take a closer look at that today. And then the final and the concluding section is talking about how a pattern that is noted throughout nature and also throughout history is about things that become strong and aggressive and then begin to decline. So all such things that fail to last are in fact moving against the Tao. Therefore, to go along with the Tao is to follow the path of peace. So this whole chapter really is about the Tao of peace. And you'll hear me make that statement quite a few times. So last time, we got to a point in our discussion about halfway through this particular chapter. This chapter has 17 lines, and last time we got to the halfway point. We were just talking about line 9. So to get the most out of the second half of our discussion, I want to make sure that we have a very solid understanding of the first half. So I've put together recaps to make sure everyone is on the same page. So the most important thing about the recap is actually the first 2 lines, and the first 2 lines basically say those who use the Tao to advise the ruler, they do not use military force or soldiers to dominate the world. And here they are. Those are the first 2 lines. So not only are these 2 lines the most important, but also they manifest at 2 levels of application. So let me put that up as a bullet point here. So the most important point is encapsulated in the first 2 lines. Those who use the Tao to advise the ruler, they don't use soldiers, military force to dominate the world. So the important thing here is to talk about the 2 levels of application that Lao Tzu has in mind. As I mentioned last time, historical context is important. So for Lao Tzu, we know that he lived roughly 2,500 years ago during the Warring States period in ancient Chinese history. It was called the Warring States period because there were multiple states, multiple kingdoms, if you will, that waged wars against one another. So this was a time when massive armies clashed. So naturally, this focused Lao Tzu, his attention on war and the suffering that war brings. By contrast, he also pointed to peace and the goodness it brings. And peace can prevail in the ancient land of China, if and when the Tao prevails, because the Tao is about peace. So one emphasis that I'm going to have for everyone is the difference between what Lao Tzu wrote and his thinking process and what the Tao has become in modern times for some people. You may come across people like this every now and then, people who use the Tao to justify everything. They will say, for instance, that the Tao encompasses all, and therefore there's peace and contention in the Tao. So that sometimes you do one, sometimes you do the other, all are part of the Tao. If you are moving naturally, you will be engaged in peace or in conflict, depending on the circumstance. So Lao Tzu would actually say that is indeed not the case. The Tao is not about picking and choosing between war and peace at different times, depending on the situation. No. The Tao, it is clear from what Lao Tzu is describing, is always toward the peace. It's always avoiding conflict. It's always seeking resolution in a peaceful way. This, however, is not the same as pacifism, another point that I raised last time. As we continue on today, it is very important for us to all understand the difference between the Tao of peace and pacifism. So we'll get there momentarily. For now, let's talk about the other level of application other than the level of kingdoms and massive armies. The other level, even more important, is the level of you. And this is because You are the ruler of your life. As such, you are in charge of the decision to wage war or keep the peace with your neighboring kingdoms. So who are your neighboring kingdoms? Well, these are the other sovereign individuals who are ruling their lives just as you are the ruler of your own life. So I am only talking about the people that you see every day, the people who are in your life today. So this can be friends, family, loved ones, acquaintances, co-workers, people in your community, people that you come across. So all these people out there, all these different kingdoms, do you wage war against them with clashes of massive armies, or do you live with them harmoniously? So very evidently, Lao Tzu says you have to be skillful in living the peaceful life and living with people in harmony. So those are the two levels, and here's the bottom line. At both the kingdom level and the personal level, the Tao of peace is exactly the same. And the Tao of peace says when you move contrary to the Tao, for instance, become aggressive and domineering, you create problems. You've seen this in your own life. You've seen other people do that. They become aggressive and domineering. They, without probably knowing it, they probably have never heard of the Tao. They're moving contrary to the Tao, against the Tao, and they create problems. They create problems for themselves, for their family, their loved ones, and for other people. There's a lot of splash damage. There's a lot of collateral damage when someone is moving against the Tao. What about the other direction? When you move with the Tao, for instance, when you treat people with respect and courtesy, you get along with them, you focus on their positive qualities, you don't complain about their failings, recognizing that you have failings of your own. When you move with the Tao, the problems disappear. You don't create new problems, and the problems that are pre-existing or the problems that other people create for you, they have a way of disappearing, of getting peacefully resolved. So that's the value of this particular chapter to our lives. And to be complete, Lao Tzu will even talk about how you should be working for peace, if at all possible, when you don't have a choice and you must fight. There are things that you must watch out for. There are rules that you must obey. So just to be complete, this is the whole picture. Like the yin and yang symbol, yin is within yang, yang is within yin. In the Tao of peace, there's a small part of it that talks about what you must do and not do when you have no choice but to fight. Okay, so this is the recap. There's a little bit more to the recap because there are some points that I really want to drive home for everyone. If we were doing this in an academic setting, the next few slides that I would show you would appear in examinations, in quizzes. So the two primary metaphors, and I know that we have some really sharp people among us. So if you are able to anticipate what's coming up, please feel free to type it in. And let me know that you're on the same mental wavelength. So the two prime metaphors, you may already know what they are, but let me share with you what they are. The first one is when Lao Tzu talks about the military encampment, that is where the army stays, where the army has settled and organized, striking camp, being prepared, setting up a base of operations, so that the military encampment That's a metaphor. And I want to make sure everyone knows exactly what it means. So remember, the way to figure out the metaphor is to think about what it is when it is like an emotional state in your heart. The military camp, when the army sets up camp, they're getting ready to regroup and attack. They're getting ready for battle. So when there is a camp for an army within your heart, that means that you are so mad that you just want to lash out against someone. So this means you harbor negative emotions, resentment, anger, hatred, etc. in your heart that can explode into violence. Has anyone ever had that experience? I certainly have. As human beings, we've all gotten so angry at one point or another in our lives that it seemed as if that anger could just explode into violence at any moment. So Lao Tzu compares that mental state, that emotional state, to an army setting up camp ready to march into battle. So that's the first primary metaphor. That's what the military encampment represents, the negative feelings that are within you. And the other one, very memorable and related to the first one, Thistles and Thorns. So, and I see that you guys are already on top of this. So Lao Tzu talks about how these prickly plants may grow in the military camp. That represents emotionally the damage that you do to yourself as you are getting ready to attack someone else. So let me put it this way. Thorns represent the self-damaging effect of negative emotions. Like thistles and thorns growing in the encampment, hurting soldiers even before they start fighting. So previously, we talked about different ways to express this. You may recall that we talked about how in the West, we compare harboring a grudge to drinking poison and hoping that the other person dies. So the idea is the same. When you drink poison, you are doing damage to yourself. And there's another saying attributed to Confucius, but actually it's Western in origin. Digging 2 graves before going on a journey of revenge. There is a Japanese saying about digging 2 holes before taking vengeance. So that could be related, but let's stick to the idea. The idea is that you need to dig 2 graves before you embark on a journey of vengeance, because that revenge that you have in your hearts, that you put into action, that's going to harm you as much as the other party, and perhaps even more so. In my life, what I have seen is that hatred, anger, negative feelings, they do way more harm than the person who harbors them than the target of the hatred. So the self-damaging effect, unfortunately, sometimes you're the one that suffers if you have that in your heart. Let me talk a little bit more about that. And I also want to recap the first half by collecting the 3 primary reasons that Lao Tzu had against conflicts. Conflicts, violence, lashing out, all of that. So from the text, we can extract three primary reasons that Lao Tzu gave against conflicts. Number one, the first reason at the very beginning of this chapter is that violent, domineering methods come back to haunt you. And what Lao Tzu said was that they tend to be returned. So when we talked about this, we reference karma quite a bit. I sometimes like to call it the big boomerang of karma, because the movement of the Tao is circular. It goes out, it describes a great circle, and then it comes back. And sometimes just because this big boomerang of karma has disappeared over the horizon, people have a tendency to assume that it's gone, never to be seen again, not realizing that beyond visual range, it's making a really big circle, and it will be flying back to hit you in the butt. It'll come back. You can't avoid it. So that is the first reason against conflicts or violence, negativity, lashing out at other people, because when you are trying to dominate other people, trying to use force against other people, these methods tend to be returned. That's reason number one. And in the West, we say those who live by violence die by violence. What a sobering statement. And that's exactly a reflection of what that first objection is from Lao Tzu. You know, do you want to die violently? Then continue your violent ways. Would you like to instead live in peace and harmony? Then you need to change your life toward peace and harmony. So the karmic nature of existence is manifesting in this particular way. So, second one, which we have seen in the metaphors, the thistles and thorns, the second reason against conflicts is because you're just going to hurt yourself. You are going to be your first victim way before the other party feels your wrath. And unfortunately, from what I have seen, what I have observed in life, sometimes the person that you hurt, there's only one, and that's you. Sometimes that's the only person to suffer, you yourself. Therefore, this is a big reason against harboring those negative emotions like anger and resentment. Now, it's not just you that will suffer when you have such hatred against others. There's more. Sometimes your loved ones get dragged into it. When you are angry, you lash out. And so often we lash out at the people who are closest to us, people who are the least deserving of bad treatment from us. But when you are in that negative emotional state of resentment, anger, and hatred, you may not even be thinking about this. You're just lashing out to vent your frustration and unwittingly hurting the people who don't deserve it, hurting the people who perhaps have nothing to do with it, nothing to do with the cause of your anger. So that's another big reason against conflicts, because it's not just you, it may be the people, the innocent bystanders who get dragged into it. So I said 3 reasons. What about reason number 3? Well, reason number 3 is a big one. And I can say it simply in one sentence: conflicts never ever end well. There's no meaningful victory when there's damage all around. So most people don't think this way. Most people think There's going to be a loser, there's going to be a winner, and you want to be on the winning side. From the Tao perspective, all sides in a conflict are losers, strictly speaking. There's gonna be one side who's regarded as the victor, but even that side is going to suffer. All right, so here's the reasoning process for that. So number one, the aftermath of a battle is always a disaster. So this is true whether you are talking about clashing armies, giant battles, or big fights between yourself and someone that you care about. And never mind someone you care about. If it's a big fight between yourself and someone that you dislike, it's still the same. The aftermath is still a disaster. So think of it this way. Let's go with the conventional concept that there's a winner and a loser. There is a side that's triumphant, and then there's a side that's defeated. Start with the defeated side. So what happens to the defeated side of a battle? Well, death and destruction, many dead bodies, a lot of injuries, a lot of destruction, plus the humiliation of defeat. Okay, so it's a disaster. The aftermath of a battle certainly is a disaster for the defeated side. So what about for the victorious side, the side that is seen as the winners? For the victorious side, it's also death and destruction. There are also many dead bodies. There's also a huge amount of damage, plus the seed of vengeance now deeply planted. So not the humiliation suffered by the defeated side, but the vengeance that will take shape and form at some point down the road, at some point in the future. When? Don't really know. You just have this vague notion that something's going to happen. So, not a great way to live, knowing that there's vengeance that's going to materialize at some point. Therefore, strictly speaking, there isn't actually a victorious side. So in a very real sense, all participants lose. It's just that for some of them, the loss may be felt at a later time. So the way that it was described by Lao Tzu is that he calls it the inauspicious year. Inauspicious year is a time of suffering and misery that always follows conflict. So the reason why he calls it inauspicious year is rather specific. He says inauspicious year because it is inauspicious for everybody. Both sides, the victors, the losers, everyone, it's inauspicious. So we know that in life, when you engage in some kind of a conflict with someone else, and after some time is over, whether you win or lose, well, the aftermath is going to be a personal disaster, just like the disaster at the kingdom level when massive armies clash. So you too will be experiencing the inauspicious year. That just means the misery and suffering will drag on for some time to come. So this is the third reason why it's just a bad idea to get into a conflict. Now, I want to make sure that the Tao is real and down to earth. I want to make sure that it's applicable to real life. Therefore, I have a slide here called real life, real world test. How can we apply the Tao to the real world? It's all very well when we're sitting here discussing the theoretical, pitfalls of warfare and violence, and how it's much, much better to be peaceful and harmonious. We can talk about that. But what happens when we leave this talk and enter back into the real world? Are we going to be able to avoid those conflicts? So I'm going to need to ask some tough questions. Questions like the following. Well, what if the other person is openly insulting me? Do I just sit there and take it? What do I do? Do I insult them back? Measure for measure? What should I do? So, throughout history, there have been great sages who focused on this particular question. So, when Jesus of Nazareth encountered this particular question, his response was to turn the other cheek. So when someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek to be struck again. So what about the Buddha? I want to use the Buddha as an example to talk about the wisdom of the Tao. So I think everyone has a notion that the Buddha is peaceful and calm. So would it be the same way? Would it be similar to Jesus to turn the other cheek to be struck again? Kind of, but not quite. We have the words of the Buddha to illustrate and illuminate this matter for us. And I see a response about keeping quiet and putting some distance between yourself and the situation. So let's compare how that is from what the Buddha has actually done. So how do we know what the Buddha did? He lived 2,500 years ago, roughly at the same time as Lao Tzu. But the Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, and Lao Tzu were physically, geographically very far apart. So remember, Lao Tzu lived in ancient China, and Sakyamuni Buddha lived in India. He started out life as an Indian prince. So these two, Lao Tzu and the Buddha, did not know of one another. And Jesus would come after them by several centuries. So certainly Jesus was not their contemporary. So how do we know what the Buddha said or what he did? Well, there's a sutra to talk about that. So I want to bring your attention to this particular sutra. I think most people probably haven't heard of this, but this is real. It's called the Sutra of 42 Chapters. There is a lot of material on this on the web. You can certainly find a lot of information. There's a Wikipedia entry as well. As the name of the sutra suggests, it has 42 chapters. Each one records something that the Buddha said or did. So in Mandarin, let me show you the name in Mandarin for this particular sutra. 佛说42章经. And sometimes it is known simply as the 42章经, the shorter version. And let me explain what those characters are. If we were to break down these characters in the title of the sutra individually, we will get this. For the first character is Buddha, the Buddha. 说 says. So 佛说 Buddha says would be similar to 子曰, which is Confucius says. Then we have 42. So 42 here. How do we figure the 3 characters here are 42? Well, the 3rd character there, that is the Mandarin character for the number 4. The next one is the Mandarin character for the number 10. So 4, 10 together, that's 40. Then we have a simple Mandarin character. The two horizontal lines means 2. So 42. Then we have the character for chapters, and finally, the last character, we have the character for sutra. So if you were to translate that title literally, it would be Buddha says 42 chapters, sutra. But it's much more commonly known as Sutra of 42 chapters. So what is the significance of this particular sutra? It has historical significance. So this is often regarded as the first Buddhist sutra translated into Chinese. So at the time that this was translated, many centuries ago, hundreds of years after the time of Lao Tzu, it was translated into classical Chinese, which today we would consider to be ancient Chinese. So I want you to be aware of that when we delve into the text, because you already know that the original Buddha, the Indian prince, he certainly didn't speak any Mandarin, or back then, ancient Chinese, which was not Mandarin, which was very different from Mandarin. He certainly didn't speak a word of ancient Chinese. But the language that he used was translated into Chinese, and therefore, because of the time of translation, it was all rendered as classical Chinese. All right, so I don't want to keep you in suspense. Let me show you exactly what the Buddha said. And let me show you one more bullet, and then I will tell you all about this. So out of the 42 chapters, all of these chapters are very short, and this particular one came from chapter 7 of the 42 chapters. So this recounted an event in the Buddha's life. This was at a time when the Buddha was becoming known as a great sage, as the sage of the Sakyamuni. He was respected by many, but not all. There were detractors, and this is similar to what everyone would encounter. If you and I were to do anything in the world, you know and I know that we're going to have both supporters and detractors. So in this particular case, it was a detractor of the Buddha who came to accost him. So he, in a jealous fit of rage, came at the Buddha, pointed to the Buddha, and cursed him. And, called him many names, wished him ill, and said all kinds of nasty things to the Buddha. Throughout that entire process, the Buddha remained quiet. He did not talk back to any of that, any of this insult that this person was dishing out openly. So right off the bat, I think the Buddha is way ahead of me, because I'm not sure that I can stay quiet in a situation like that. I probably get all worked up, excited, shaking, and getting ready to do battle. I would probably feel this adrenaline I will probably get ready to take some kind of action, maybe violent action. But the Buddha remained silent, did not respond to any of it until the detractor, the critic of the Buddha, ran out of steam. It's really hard to keep going cursing someone if they don't respond. If they do respond, you know that you will find more fuel, more emotional fuel to keep going with your scolding and cursing. But if the other one does not respond, it's not as fun, not as interesting. So pretty soon, if you encounter someone like that and you're cursing them out, they don't respond at all, yeah, you're gonna run out of steam too. So when the detractor has stopped, the Buddha asked a question. Here's what he said. This is all written in classical Chinese because it was translated to classical Chinese. So just imagine that the original Buddha was speaking his own language. Now, what I want to do is to translate this for you. It's got 3 lines. So here's what the Buddha said. The first line, when you give someone a present. Second line, but that person does not accept it. The present is not accepted. What happens to the present? Does it return back to you? That is the third line. So some key characters here. Many of you following this lecture, you have already learned to recognize that 人, this character means person. The character right in the middle of the first line, that's the character for gift or present. So that line is talking about when you give someone a present, whatever that present may be. So the character 人 is repeated in the second line here, and then that's followed by this character 不, another simple character that's often used in Mandarin. It means no. No or not. And the last character in the second line is accept. So basically it says, well, that person does not accept. The present is not accepted. So down at the third line, the first character is the same character as the middle character in the first line. As you can see, the third character here is the same as the first character here. Then the second character is return. Now I have a question mark here, but in classical Chinese, there were no punctuation marks. They used characters for punctuation marks. Who, this very last character here, was one of the ancient Chinese characters used for punctuation. So that's the question. Present, return, back to you? Yes. So the man who had been cursing out the Buddha said, well, yeah, if I give someone a present, but the present's not accepted, then I still have it. I still end up with it. So the Buddha says, well, today you are scolding me. You are giving me the present of scolding, cursing, wishing me ill. But I don't respond. I don't accept this present you are giving me. Therefore, what happens to this present that you're trying to push into my hands? Well, you still end up with it. So the troubles that you are wishing for me, the misfortune, the bad luck, the bad things that you are hoping will happen to me, all of those negative wishes that you are wrapping up in a package to give to me, I don't accept. So you end up with all these negative problems with yourself. They return back to you they visit back upon you. So this is like how shadow follows form. You can't escape it, you can't avoid it. So now, the man who had been cursing the Buddha realizes the same thing that Lao Tzu had been saying in chapter 30, and that is this negativity that he harbored in his heart that he was going to use to lash out at the other party, the Buddha. Well, it didn't go anywhere. He still had it. He still suffered from that negativity. So, finally, the Buddha concluded, so this is the reason why we don't want to follow the path of malice. Buddha realized the same truth that Lao Tzu did, that if there is this anger, resentment, hatred in your heart, well, guess what? The first person you harm is going to be yourself. So that is taken from chapter 7 of what the Buddha has said in 42 chapters. It's one of the sutras in Buddhism. Perhaps one day, if there's interest, we'll translate the whole thing into English. I think that may be fun. For now, though, let's stick to the Tao perspective. So, how well do you suppose this matches with the Tao perspective? I think you can see the agreement between the Buddha and Lao Tzu, even though they did not know one another at the time that they lived. So, what is the Tao perspective? What do we know about the Tao? Well, we know the Tao is all about simplicity. So that's one aspect of it that we can already identify, because what the Buddha said is the essence of simplicity. I think we can all agree to that. So simple. Well, if someone is trying to put out some negativity, you don't accept it, well, that person is the one who still ends up with it. Simple, but true. And we know the Tao is also universal. That is, the Tao is all about the human condition. It's not about the ancient Chinese versus modern Westerners. No, it's about the commonality among all human beings, whether Asian or otherwise. Therefore, this is wisdom that is suitable for East and West. In fact, North and South, no matter where you happen to be, you can practice this particular wisdom. In order for a wisdom to be the Tao, you must have that universal appeal, that universal applicability, that anyone in the world can take it and use it and benefit from it. Lastly, I think this is fun. Lastly, the Tao perspective is return to the child. And here I want to quote everyone something that you may remember from kindergarten. I'm rubber, you are glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. So even a child knows about this. And the child is expressing something that maybe is using different words, but actually the same profound wisdom that the Buddha said. So there you have it. We have wisdom that is simple, that is universal, and that recalls to mind the wisdom of the inner child. So having said that, we must now return to the Tao Te Ching and push our understanding a step further. So let's go ahead and set that up for our discussion in the second half of this meeting. So last time we visited with this particular slide, let me take a moment and ask everyone to take a look, see if you recall. As you can see, I have isolated this character, which is repeated quite a few times, 6 times. This character is 果, which means fruit. Here, though, it's not about fruits, it's about results. As I mentioned previously, this is exactly the same English usage about the fruits of one's labors, hard work coming into fruition, etc. So the proper way to translate 果 is results. That's actually really the only acceptable translation for that particular character. So it is oftentimes not true that Chinese characters can be translated into many different ways. Sometimes it's true, other times it can only be translated in a few ways. So we looked at this last time. Keep that in mind, achieving results. Then we also looked at this particular slide. This slide calls back to the beginning of this chapter about not dominating the world. So I wanted to visit this slide again to reiterate these important points. That for the true cultivator of the Tao, you can get very good at defeating your opponents, but even if you become very skillful at it, there is no pleasure, delight, or glory. There's nothing positive in doing that. There should be regret in having to defeat someone, because just by having to do that, you already know that it's because you failed to make that person a friend or ally. So for the Tao cultivator who really understands Lao Tzu, that person will not be celebrating any kind of victory. Instead, the cultivator will be reviewing past actions to try to figure out, where did I go wrong? How did I get it to a point where I had to fight someone? And more importantly, how can I manage things better down the road so next time something similar comes up, I won't have to fight? So this is extremely important. This would be a skillful use of the past. This is not so much dwelling on the past and becoming attached to the past. Rather, this is to use personal experience from the past to learn something new that can be applied to the future. So to that extent, it is something that is very much in tune with the Tao, to review past actions in that way. We're on to line 10, 11, and 12. So what I have done here, as you can see, is that I've taken the last character and highlighted 3 of them. So the first 3 characters of each line, as you can see, are exactly the same. So from line 10 all the way down to line 14, the first 2 characters are the same. And from 10 down to 12, the first 3 characters are the same. So let's focus on these characters. And you can pretty much count on these characters mapping to the last word in translation. So it's advantageous a lot of times to have a translation that doesn't vary too much with the original, that tries to be as faithful to the original as possible. So we've got the 3 characters, meaning to brag, to flaunt, or to be arrogant. So let's talk about these 3 things. First of all, in the Tao, the proper attitude of the victorious is solemn, serious, and fully aware of the damage that have been caused. So because you are aware of all the negativity, all the problems, all the destruction, the damage that have been caused, it is then very natural for you to not let it go to your head. So that awareness makes it impossible to brag about winning, because you know about the horrible things that was done for the win. Arrogance is also not possible because you know, as a Tao cultivator, that when you had to fight, it meant that you did something wrong. So here's what I want to explore. This is going to become important. And let me get the following out. We're going to come back to this. This is talking about a military commander who achieves results but does not brag, achieves results but does not flaunt, achieves results but is not arrogant. Let me ask everyone, when you look at these three lines, do you feel that they repeat kind of the same point? If not, then what is the difference between bragging, flaunting, and becoming arrogant? So, not meant to be a trick question. So when bragging, bragging about a victory, bragging about winning in battle, that's about boasting when you talk about how great you are. Flaunting is similar, but a little bit different. The best way that I can explain this is to say that, you know, and I know, you've seen and I've seen someone that you know to be really stuck up, really a boastful person, but who will, intentionally not say anything about something that you know that he or she wants to brag about. But even though they say nothing, the expression on their face says it all. A superior, smug expression. A sort of a smirk, kind of a twisted smile, a smile of complete self-satisfaction. So that is someone who's flaunting without bragging necessarily. So it's not just to talk about it, it's also to display, to show it. So those are the subtle differences between bragging and flaunting. Arrogance is the mental state that drives both. It's the attitude of basically, I'm better than everybody, it's all about me. Me. I'm the greatest. So that is the difference between those three characters. So they should be expressed differently. They should not all be grouped in the same way, because Lao Tzu wanted to be very sure that people who follow the Tao would not brag about their various success, would not flaunt, would not show it, not just refrain from talking about it, but also not show it, and would be humble rather than arrogant. All right, so having explained that difference, let's continue on. Here's another important one. Line 13, achieves results, but only out of necessity. So this is underlying, this is the underlying point about the reluctance of Tao cultivators to fight. It's not that it's impossible for them to fight. If you were a pure pacifist, you would refuse to fight no matter what. The Tao cultivator is not quite that. The Tao cultivator may have to fight, but will know that it's a problem to have to fight. So that's the difference. And they fight only when they have no other choice. So for instance, when they're backed into a corner, when they have to at least fight to break away from a bad situation, to escape, to put some distance between themselves and a source of conflict and negativity, then there's going to be a time when they're actually fighting. So here's the bullet point. This line reinforces Lao Tzu's point that you fight only because you got outmaneuvered and cornered, and therefore had no choice. Both this line and the next emphasize the peaceful Tao by repetition. So because I mentioned pure pacifism, I want to bring that up again here. The difference between this and pure pacifism, where violence is absolutely and unconditionally rejected. So this is one of the takeaways that I hope to accomplish in our time together today. I want everyone to be able to express the difference between the Tao of peace and pacifism. And if you decide that you want to follow pacifism instead of the Tao of peace, that's totally fine. The important point for me is that you know the difference between the two. Okay, so let's talk about 14. Achieves results but does not dominate. So you can see that this is reiterating a point that's being repeated. This last character here, 强, usually means strong or forceful. Here, it means the domination of the strong and forceful in an aggressive way. So this is a reiteration of the same point. Don't try to dominate. So generally speaking, Lao Tzu, here's the point that I want to make with this. The lines 10, 11, 12, they have different characters here, and they talk about slightly different things. They're all related to the mentality of arrogance. Now, the last character here, translated as dominate, this is actually the same character that's repeated in different places in this particular chapter. So this kind of repetition is to emphasize a point that Lao Tzu feels is important. So in this particular case, the most important point for Lao Tzu is the following. It is imperative in the Tao that even in victory, there is humility. So how easy is that to practice in real life? In real life, we have seen almost 100% of the time that the people who win, that they approach their victory without a whole lot of humility. It would take the rare individual who understands the Tao, either by studying Lao Tzu or to understand the Tao intuitively and naturally. That person can perhaps be humble even at a time of victory. Now, Tao cultivators go further. It's not just being humble in victory, but also understanding the damage that had been caused. The Tao cultivator replaces the typical domineering posture. This is most people fall into this trap. Tao cultivators will replace that with regret, gratitude, learning, and courtesy. So not a whole lot of victory celebration from the perspective of the Tao cultivator. So let me bring up an example that I want to highlight for everyone. This is an example from actually a historical person, 叶问. So there's a movie made about 叶问, starring Donnie Yen. And 叶问 was a famous martial arts master in the southern parts of China. And he was also someone who was versed, steeped in the Tao traditions. Therefore, despite possessing devastating arts of hand-to-hand combat, he was also extremely humble and gracious. And he really followed the teaching of not engaging in conflicts. So 叶问, because of his fame as a martial arts master, he was oftentimes visited by other martial arts practitioners who wanted to challenge him to a fight. So in the movie about 叶问, here's the scene. So 叶问, in the middle, is greeting his visitor. He is putting his hands together in the customary gesture of greeting from ancient China. And you'll notice that it's the left hand wrapping the right hand. The right hand is a fist. The left hand wraps around it. That is a gesture of peace. The right hand is seen as the hand of violence. The left hand is the hand of peace. Wrapping around the right hand means I greet you in peace. I mean you no harm. So in this greeting, in this scene of greeting, 叶问 is being very courteous to his visitors, welcoming his visitor into his own home, and wanting to basically treat him with tea and maybe just a pleasant chat. But the visitor would have none of that. The visitor made it clear that he's here to challenge 叶问, the master, to see who is better or more powerful in the martial arts. So to this, 叶问declined. And nah, it's all right. You can tell everybody that you're the superior fighter. That's totally fine with me. Now, the challenger, the visitor, knows that just by saying that, people are not going to believe it. People will say, yeah, sure, right. He told you to say that. You didn't actually defeat him. So he's very insistent upon actually fighting to compare their martial arts, to have a contest, so to speak. So this went on for a while until 叶问 basically backed into a corner, had no idea, had no choice but to fight. So during their battle, they're moving around 叶问's residence. This is the mansion where 叶问lives, and pretty much in danger of destroying the furniture as they're moving around in very quick and powerful ways. So at one point, it became clear that 叶问 was far superior in martial arts, and his visitor was actually stumbling around a little bit as a result of their back and forth. So as the visitor is about to fall, 叶问 reaches out to prevent his guest from falling. And this was, of course, a loss of face for the visitor, who then recovers and redoubles his effort to defeat 叶问, his host. So eventually, it got to a point where the visitor had no choice but to admit that 叶问, the master, was a far superior fighter. So he luckily was not harmed at all. 叶问 made his point about being able to defeat him easily, but stopping short of actually striking. making physical contact. So the scene that you see on top is before the conflict. Then it goes on for maybe 20 minutes of some really great action choreography. And then after that, the visitor admits defeats. And here's the after. So looking at the two, before and after, you probably think that, well, they seem almost exactly the same framing, the same courtesy from Ye Wen to his guest. This is because Ye Wen, in acting in accordance with the Tao, is demonstrating no boasting, no flaunting his victory, but rather humility. He's basically regretting that they had to be in conflict with one another. He was apologetic, he was gracious, and he thanked his visitor for coming in to teach him a lesson. Now, the visitor, the challenger, knowing that he had been soundly defeated, now has nothing but admiration for this gracious gentleman who happened to practice martial arts. And from that point on, will become a friend and ally of Ye Wen, the main character. So, do you know Ye Wen? Well, you do, but perhaps under a different pronunciation of his name. Because Ye Wen is from the southern parts of China, what he spoke was Cantonese. So pronunciation of his name in Mandarin is Ye Wen, but in Cantonese, when phonetically translated to English, is Yip Man. And Yip Man is the master who taught Bruce Lee. So now you know this historical person portrayed here by actor Donnie Yen. This is how he was as a martial arts master, but more than that, as a warrior of the Tao who'd adhere to the teachings of Lao Tzu, Ye Wen, Yip Man. So these two scenes that you see are screenshots from that movie, and this is the first fight choreography from that movie. So I think, a good example. Okay, so we're getting toward the end of this particular chapter in our analysis. Pretty good timing too. We have a lot more to talk about. We have a lot more to summarize and then to paraphrase. So let's take a look at line 15. Line 15 says, things become strong and then get old. So let's analyze that. What is this line talking about? So first of all, first character here is things, as in living things. Then 壮 means strong. And then the last character here, 老, means old. So the line is literally translated as things become strong and then get old. So it's a pattern that the ancient sages noticed in nature, that invariably living things move through stages in life. Before they began to suffer the toils of old age, they begin to wither away from old age. Prior to that, they attain the peak of their strength. So that's a pattern that nature follows. Ancient sages also noticed that this wasn't just living things, living creatures, but it applied also historically to empires. That is, empires would also begin to wither and decay and break apart but prior to that, they attained their peak of prominence and strength and power. And it also applies to many other things. For instance, individuals. So let me put that up as a bullet item there. This applies to not just living things that attain the strength of full maturity and then go into the decline of old age. All living things do that. But let's talk about manifestations that are not necessarily living creatures. Think about fire burning out. So you've seen this, I'm pretty sure, that when fire burns out, you have many times seen how it can burn bright and hot for an instant and then dies down. So that's the kind of thing, that's the sort of thing that Lao Tzu is talking about. It's a pattern that seems to be repeated all throughout nature. So think about that fire and then visualize that as a human being. So imagine someone becoming very aggressive and then shortly after that suffers the negative consequences of aggression. So that is like fire burning bright and hot and then dying down. Like a human being becoming aggressive and then suffers the negative consequences. So Lao Tzu says, whenever you see something like that, a person who becomes aggressive and then instant karma takes him down, well, Lao Tzu would say, this is not the Tao. Why? Because this pattern to burn out, to burn bright and then burn out, well, it's not the Tao because it's not something that lasts. To be congruent with the Tao, you have to continue to shine and not just burn out in a moment, in an instant, just like that. So this is something that that's described in different ways. So for instance, in the West, we can talk about something like that as flash in the pan. We use that expression, flash in the pan, when we describe someone who has a sudden and brief success that is not repeated or repeatable. Again, that's not the Tao. Flash in the pan, not the Tao. A meteor flashing across the sky, burning bright, burning out, not the Tao. That is transient. It's not lasting. What is the Tao? Well, the Tao is not something that comes and goes. It's more like this steady, flowing mountain stream. The Tao is more like the stream that is ever flowing, steady and reliable. There is nothing dazzling or surprising about it, about the mountain stream. That mountain stream will continue to flow indefinitely. That's the Tao. That's where actually Lao Tzu would say we need to emulate the stream that's continuous, not the flash in the pan. Last line. Last line says, that which is contrary to the Tao soon ends. So this is a reiteration from the other side. If you move against the Tao, you meet an early demise. You won't last. You will perish. So this is why throughout history, powerful empires have declined and collapsed. Now, when you take it down from the level of history to your personal life and think about how when you grew up, the bullies that you saw in kindergarten, in elementary school, in junior high, in high school, even college and university, maybe even your postgraduate degree, postgraduate studies. In all of those settings, as you are growing up, you have seen how bullies simply don't last. It's the same at the workplace. Bullies get their way temporarily. They brag about it to everyone. And before too long, the negative consequences catch up to them. It's a pattern that never fails. And we're seeing this now left and right. If you just pay attention to the news, you notice this pattern everywhere. So there's a little bit more that I want to say about this to wrap this up in a nice, neat package for chapter 30. We're now at the very last line. That which is contrary to the Tao soon ends. I want everyone to pay attention to something that I have said before for previous previous chapters, and that is the last line always connects back to the first line. So notice how it's doing that here. If you remember the first line of this chapter is about those who use the Tao to advise the ruler. That these were the wise ones who would not use soldiers to dominate the world. And that's line 2. So now we can see the entire chapter is about violence, fighting, conflicts, being opposite to the Tao, being against the Tao, not in accordance with the Tao, not the way to go. So the point is, as we live our lives, we have to use the Tao to advise ourselves, to make better decisions. And that decision cannot be to enact violence, domination, etc. So this is what the Tao really is. Not aggressive, not warlike, not domineering, not arrogant. At the same time, though, it is also not passive. And the reason why I say that is because we've got multiple lines. We've got about half a dozen lines that talk about the commander who prevails in combat, but will only do so out of necessity and will not be arrogant, etc. So the Tao is not aggressive, not warlike, not domineering, but also not passive. This is important. And this is what I call the Tao of peace. And I want to make sure that we see how this is all connected together. I have a slide specifically talking about that. The Tao of peace. So the last line that you have just seen. If you are contentious, you move against the Tao and will soon perish. All things against the Tao cannot last. The bully that I talked about previously, whether it's from elementary school or high school or any other stage of your life, they can't last. So this is the last line. Now let's see how it connects to the first two lines. And the first two lines are the following. Those who use the Tao to advise the ruler, they do not use soldiers to dominate the world. Let's apply that to you, to your life. As you counsel yourself in your interactions with other sovereign individuals in your life, you should refrain from using soldiers. Soldiers is the metaphor for aggression, to attain some sort of domination. That will most certainly get you moving against the Tao. And if you are against the Tao, soon you too will perish, because all things against the Tao cannot last. So that's how these all ties together. Okay, now time for a test question. So I think this is fun, and I want to encourage everyone's participation. I want to hear what you think. I don't think it's too difficult. Let's talk about it. I have a question for you in regards to everything that we have talked about today and it's a multiple choice question. It's practical. It's kind of a down-to-earth, pragmatic kind of question because it's talking about real life. So here's the question. So you know, having learned from this chapter, you are careful to not provoke or offend others, but you know some of them will try to pick a fight with you once in a while. What is the best way to handle that? So basically what I'm saying is that it's all good and fine that you understand the Tao and you're going to be a person of peace. You're not going to go around picking fights. But what about other people? What about people who want to pick a fight with you? So very similar to the question that we explored just a moment ago with the Buddha, with someone who was a detractor and a critic, and someone who cursed him out publicly. Similar to that. You're not going to go pick a fight with someone else, but what if they come at you? What if they, a lot of times will say, oh, that person, you know, he is really asking for it. Well, we'll say it that way. He's really asking to be smacked down, to be taught a lesson. We say that. So we know that in life, we will oftentimes have people who will try to do that to us. So multiple choice question, what are the choices? I've got 5 choices here. 1, attack them before they attack you. Take care of the problem while it is still small. So I don't know if anyone remembers, but in the Dao De Jing, it actually talks about that. It actually talks about resolving an issue while it is still small and easily handled. So wouldn't that be the Tao? To nip it in the bud, to head them off at the pass, attack them before they attack you, take care of the problem while it's a small problem? That's number 1. Number 2, do what Jesus would do, which we have seen is similar to what the Buddha would do. And what Jesus would do is turn the other cheek and refuse to engage because it takes 2 to tango. So it seems like we have the Buddha that was very much in agreement with Jesus. He did not engage. And in a similar situation, it took 2 to tango. So the person who was cursing him out, scolding him, he ran out of steam. And then that gift, that presence of negativity still stayed with him. So maybe that's the best way to handle it. Is it? Well, there are 3 other choices. So let's take a look at more. Number 3, go all out in your counterattack. Make them regret it so they will never do it again. So this has the appeal, I think, to my younger self when I was a teenager. This is how I thought, that I'm going to overwhelm the other side with so much power and force that they're going to rue the day that they cross me. That was my silly, immature teenage fantasy, power fantasy. How about number 4? Defend yourself and seek reconciliation if at all possible. Well, that sounds likely. That seems like, you know, reconciliation is a theme in the Tao that you want to turn enemies into friends. Number 5, the last choice, ignore them, for they hurt only themselves. So wouldn't it be the same application of the line that we have seen in this chapter, that the negativity they harbor in their hearts would also poison them, that they would also suffer and be damaged when they harbor such hate against you? So these choices are intentionally set up to be a little confusing, to be a little bit vague, and I want to respond and pick the best choice from a Tao perspective. And I can already see that some people have the right answer. For those of you who are not sure, I think we can make things easier by a process of elimination. Let's go through them one by one. So attack them before they attack you, take care of the problem while it is still small. I'm gonna have to say that's not the best way. So the chapter in the Tao Te Ching that says to resolve an issue when it is still a small issue before it shows signs of big trouble, there's wisdom in that, but it should not be misapplied to imply, to say that you want to preemptively attack someone before they attack. Instead, if you sense hostility, you certainly want to take action while the matter is still relatively small. You want to do that by reaching out a hand of friendship in attempting to understand what the problem is and having that understanding resolve the conflict before it even occurs. So the action that you would take in accordance to the Tao Te Ching is not to attack before they attack, but to reach out to them and communicate before it comes to a conflict. So I have to say, I'm gonna have to cross out the first one. That's not the Tao. Number two, do what Jesus would do, which we have seen is similar to what the Buddha would do. How about the Tao? How about the Tao perspective? It seems to be congruent with the Tao as well. So here, I'm gonna say, not quite, because what Jesus taught and what the Buddha taught are closer to pacifism. What the Tao taught, and remember, the Tao came to us from the time of the warring states. What the Tao taught is a little bit different in that if you have no choice but to fight, do so with the following rules, with a series of rules. Therefore, the Tao is not about turning the other cheek. The Tao is, in some cases, when you have no choice, about taking action. So there are times when you don't want to engage. Definitely true. It's the same in the Tao. But there's going to be times when, for instance, survival is an issue, or you have to defend a cause or protect loved ones. Then you have to take action. Then you may not have the luxury to turn the other cheek. So when that is the case, we should also cross out number two. So I think these are fairly obvious. Let's take a look at number three, counterattack. Well, I think from this particular chapter, you see that the commander who understands the Tao will never do more than is necessary to accomplish an objective. So to go all out, overkill would certainly not be the Tao. And then number 4 and 5, purposely make them to be likely choices. And, it can be a little confusing. I can certainly applaud the virtue and the thinking behind pacifism, behind the great wisdom taught by Jesus as well as the Buddha. So all I'm saying is that Lao Tzu taught a slightly different lesson. So let's take a look at 4 and 5. Defend yourself. Okay, that's taking action. See reconciliation. Yeah, hopefully turn enemies into allies if at all possible. May not be possible, but deserves a try. Number 5, ignore them. Okay, well, that may not be practical. because someone may be coming at you and you have to do something, even if that something is just to back away and avoid. So you can't necessarily ignore something that is happening or someone with hostile intentions. And they may be hurting themselves, but suppose they cause collateral splash damage and it affects you too, or the people who are innocent bystanders. So you may not always be able to afford the luxury of ignoring someone, ignoring a troublemaker. So then, number 4 is the choice. And it seems like number 4 and number 5 are superficially the same, but remember, the Tao is about taking the appropriate action. Sometimes the appropriate action is to stay back and observe. Other times, the appropriate action may be to put some distance between yourself and the source of problems. And in rare occasions, when you have mismanaged the situation, so you have to fight, the appropriate action may be to fight. So all of this is part of the Tao of peace. So let me further explain. So the difference is clear for everyone. The reason why we come at it from so many different angles is just to make sure that it's clear. Pacifism, here's the dictionary definition of pacifism. When someone is pacifistic, that person is opposed to war or violence of any kind. So I got this out of a dictionary. There are variations within the philosophy of pacifism noted, but in the most pure form of pacifism, all violence, any kind of violence, even in self-defense, is rejected. So that isn't exactly the same as the Tao of peace. The Tao of peace will say, when your survival is at stake, take action. Now, let me also talk about Westernized Dow, which is also not exactly the Tao. It's not the authentic Tao. It sounds like the authentic Tao. It's taught by some of the most superficial gurus that we have, and it is absolutely incorrect. Here's what the Westernized Dow sounds like. The Tao encompasses all, so it is only natural that you will sometimes be peaceful and sometimes be combative. No matter which way it happens to be, you simply flow with it. So I say this is superficial because this gives license to someone following his whims to be either peaceful or combative. In the overall sense, because our practice of the Tao is not perfect, sometimes you may find it necessary when you're backed into a corner that you need to be combative. But that's not the Tao. It means you have failed in your practice of the Tao. So to flow with it, to say that the Tao encompasses all, this is the twisted, distorted version of the Tao. So I have to reject. The Tao of peace says there's nothing good about conflicts. And it doesn't matter if it's a battle between armies or arguments between individuals, it's not a good thing. Therefore, the warriors of the Tao may be supremely skilled in the art of war, but they will only use those skills subject to certain conditions, stringent conditions, conditions expressed by Lao Tzu in this chapter. So this is extracted from the middle of the chapter, the 6 conditions about Tao cultivators. When can they fight? What happens when they fight? Well, number 1, they fight only when there is no other way out. When survival is at stake, as I mentioned, when you must defend the cause or protect loved ones, when you're backed into a corner and you have to fight to get out of a bad situation, take action. When there's no other choice, take action. Now, when you're backed into a corner and you have to fight your way out, After that, you have to review, how did I get back into a corner? That should not have happened. So number 2, do what is necessary and then full stop. So Tao cultivators, the second condition for them to go into battle is that they will only do the minimum necessary, stop as soon as possible. No such thing as overkilling the Tao. The Tao is a practice of compassion. You want to do the least amount of harm and preferably no harm at all. Number 3, no bragging. Never brag about victories, because when you really see everything from the eyes of the Tao, you know there are no true victories in battles. No true victories in physically defeating someone else. The truest victory of all is when you overcome yourself. That is also made clear in the Tao Te Ching. Number 4, no flaunting. So it's not just talking about it, which is bragging or boasting. It's also to not display signs of success, to flaunt, to show off. No flaunting of success, because no one truly succeeds when they clash with other people. Everyone will end up suffering. Number 5, no arrogance. Tao cultivators will not become arrogant for having achieved their objectives. Instead, that achievement humbles them. For all those reasons. Number 6, the last one, Tao cultivators will not become domineering over those they have bested. Instead, they wish to extend friendship. They are apologetic that a conflict was necessary. They never meant for it to go that far. And now that it has, it's time to remedy the situation. It's time to make up for the lack that led to the conflict in the first place. So the Tao of Peace, this is as clear cut as I can make it. This is exactly as clear as possible how Lao Tzu sees conflict in general. This is the purest and most accurate presentation of the way that Lao Tzu will look at warfare and also interpersonal conflicts. It brings us to the end of Tao Te Ching chapter 30. I am happy to see that indeed we have time for the paraphrase. So previously we have often run out of time for that. Today we're going to be able to do it. So let's go ahead and demonstrate understanding by expressing the original with modern language. Section 1. This is the important part. As I mentioned, the first 2 lines encapsulate the whole thing, the Tao of peace. Here, we also have to, in the paraphrase, capture line 3 about how methods of domination, of violence, of force tend to be returned. You invite karmic repercussions, karmic consequences when you get into violence. So here is the paraphrase. In ancient times, ministers who knew the Tao would advise the king against waging war because they understood that a ruler who attacked others would eventually become the target of attacks. The same thing applies to everyone, not just kings. Anyone who attacks will eventually be attacked. Next section, this is about the metaphors. The metaphors that are being used here, if you recall, is the military encampment and the thistles and thorns that grow, representing the damaging effects of negativity. So here is the paraphrase that I would like to offer. When you harbor hate in your heart, it is as if you have set up camp for an army there, ready to wage war. The hatred damages you first, like thistles and thorns growing in the encampment, hurting the soldiers. After a battle has been fought, its effects remain. A conflict, regardless of outcome, leaves all of its participants worse off than before, even those who think they have won. Next section is about the commander. Remember, the third section is where we get the conditions, the 6 conditions or the 6 rules for fighting from the Tao perspective. So here's the paraphrase that I would like to offer. Those who understand the Tao avoid conflicts whenever possible. If they must fight, they do the minimum necessary and then stop without trying to dominate others. Although they can be extremely effective in achieving their objectives, they do so without bragging or flaunting. They know there is only illusory glory in what most people consider victories. So their accomplishments do not make them arrogant. Indeed, they regret having to fight out of necessity. It means they have mismanaged the situation in some way, because the ideal in the Tao is the win-win resolution of conflict. Victory for all without anyone having to attack or being dominated by anyone else. Okay, now we're coming right up to the very last section, and this is about things being contrary to the Tao. Those that are contrary, they don't last. So here is the paraphrase for that. In nature and history, we have seen how an increase in strength and aggression leads to aging and decay. This is a pattern we can discern in living things as well as empires. It is contrary to the Tao because such things perish while the Tao lasts. Our goal is to follow the Tao and continue on in peace and harmony. So that's it for chapter 30. I am really happy that we were able to go through the whole thing, explain everything, and we can end with a summary of the chapter, which is going to be, and I'm using the first line there. This is going to be a true summary in that I want to bring out all the major points, the points that if I had a choice, I would ask everyone to remember just the major points to be able to get the most out of this chapter. So first, understand the 2 primary metaphors used in this chapter. So it shouldn't be a big challenge. Go ahead and respond if you already know what they are. But the 2 primary metaphors are, number 1, the military encampment, and number 2, thistles and thorns. Make sure you remember what they mean. The The camp for the military is when you harbor negative feelings and you're ready to explode into an attack upon someone else. Thistles and thorns, that's the drinking poison part where you are damaging yourself with your negativity. Okay, what else? 3 reasons against violence. So Lao Tzu specified 3 different reasons against violence. Please be sure you know what they are. Number 1, he said that such methods tend to be returned. He's talking about the karmic effect. He's talking about how negativity, violence, will beget more negativity and more violence. We've seen that to be the case. Number 2, the second reason against violence, self-damage. And this is from the 2 primary metaphors, 1 and 2 here, the military encampment when you harbor a grudge, and thistles and thorns when you damage yourself. And if you prefer, you can just use the sayings popular in the West that you drink poison hoping for someone else to die. I think that's very colorful and I think it's very good. And reason number 3 against violence is the inauspicious year. That's the negative aftermath of conflict. Whether it's armies clashing, of people arguing, what's in the aftermath of the conflict is always bad. It's always negative. So that's another reason against violence. Lastly, remember the 6 conditions. What were they? Pretty simple. Number 1, fight only if there is no choice. And then you got to figure out why you left yourself with no choice. You probably took a misstep somewhere. Number 2, fight, but stop as soon as possible. Do the minimum necessary and nothing further. 3, fight and win, but no bragging to win. No bragging, no boasting about how great you were on the battlefield. And number 4 is similar. You can tell why I grouped them together. No flaunting, no talking about your victory, no showing off. So no bragging, no flaunting, they're together. Number 5, no arrogance. That's what drives the bragging and flaunting. So don't go thinking that you are all that because you have won. You should be feeling very humble. And number 6, no domination. No trying to exercise your power over other people. That is a big no-no. So it's something that will be against the Tao, leading to an early demise.
Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.